We have more than 40 participants who have registered for online meeting today, and I would like to remind you that the first or opening session of the meeting is on the record. It is not being broadcast live, but its full recording should be available online soon, hopefully within 24 hours. I would especially like to welcome Deputy Foreign Minister of the Russian Federation, Sergey Ryabkov, who attended many of the CENESS dialogue meetings, including the very first one that took place in Monterey in April 2016. Your Excellency, your support for the Russian-US dialogue of experts and scholars on nuclear issues over the years is a great encouragement and very much appreciated. Sergey Alexeyevich, большое спасибо. In view of previous years' experience, there is not much point trying to assess the dynamics of Russian-US relations in the past 6 months since the arrival of the new administration in Washington. But it is at least safe to say that these relations have not deteriorated further from late January until July of this year. There is even some evidence that contacts are being restored between Russia and the United States on arms control and some issues of the nuclear non-proliferation agenda. The New START Treaty has been extended for the maximum 5-year term. The joint statement on strategic stability made by 2 presidents at the summit in Geneva reaffirmed the Gorbachev-Reagan principle that the nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. The 2 presidents also agreed to launch an integrated bilateral dialogue on strategic stability. Additionally, cooperation is underway in Vienna to bring all original parties of the JCPOA to full compliance with the deal. According to official reports, Korean Peninsula issues were among the subjects of a phone conversation between President Putin and President Biden and between Foreign Minister Lavrov and Secretary of State Blinken. All these developments are, of course, very welcome, but it is important to make sure that these agreements reached in Geneva and during other official discussions lead to concrete action instead of being quietly forgotten, as happened after the Trump-Putin summit in Helsinki in July 2018. It is also important to make sure that the dialogue on strategic stability becomes regular and to find a framework for a regular discussion of the challenges and risks in the area of nuclear non-proliferation. Such a channel existed even during the Cold War. Speaking of nuclear issues, it is also necessary to emphasize the importance of establishing a regular channel for dialogue on the future of nuclear energy. Without nuclear energy, it would be impossible to achieve our climate goals. Russia and the United States already have a legal framework, namely the 123 agreement, not only for dialogue, but for practical cooperation as well. In his recent interview published in the Kommersant newspaper on July 16, thanks to Elena Chernenko for this interview, US Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, John Kerry, stated that bilateral cooperation on climate change should include joint research and possibly technology exchange. I would like to hope that Kerry's statements will be followed by concrete cooperation projects and that the discussion of such projects can take place without delay on the sidelines of the upcoming IAEA General Conference in September. In the existing circumstances, an important role must be played by the expert community. That expert community, creative ideas and initiatives should provide support to the official dialogue process. Incidentally, in recent years, many think tanks have been calling on the Russian and US governments to reiterate their commitment to the Gorbachev-Reagan principle. In this context, we at CENESS are pleased to continue the Russian-US dialogue on nuclear issues and hope that senior US officials will rejoin that dialogue this year. One last thing I would like to remind is that CENESS has already begun active preparations for the 2022 Moscow Non-Proliferation Conference, which is scheduled from April 7 to April 9 next year. Given the growing pace of vaccinations, I am optimistic that it will be possible for the conference to be held in person. We have already begun discussions on this issue with experts and officials in many capitals, including in the Middle East and on the Korean Peninsula. To conclude my brief introductory remarks, I would like to welcome all the participants once again and to thank the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies for their partnership in this dialogue, and turn the floor to the co-chair of the dialogue, Professor William Potter, for his welcome remarks. Bill, over to you.
Thank you so much, Anton. As always, it's a pleasure for me personally and for CENESS institutionally to join Anton and CENESS in welcoming you to this latest round of Russia-US discussions on nuclear issues. I also want to second the warm welcome extended by Anton to Deputy Foreign Minister Sergey Ryabkov, who has, as Anton mentioned, been with us on many occasions in the past, and it's always a pleasure to have him with us. In recent years, it's been a glum and nearly impossible task to find encouraging news on the nuclear arms control and non-proliferation front. It is therefore with great relief that at this meeting, we have an opportunity to reflect on last month's Geneva summit and to consider the prospects for a new strategic stability dialogue. This dialogue can take many possible forms and may contribute significantly to a more predictable and mutually beneficial US-Russian relationship, possibly including a path forward to both bilateral and multilateral nuclear arms control, as well as useful confidence-building measures. In this regard, I believe we should not underestimate the importance of the reaffirmation at the Geneva summit of the Reagan-Gorbachev principle that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. In my view, it would be very timely for those participating in the strategic stability dialogue to explore various ways in which the United States and Russia could promote the multilateralization of this principle, including perhaps by introducing a resolution on the subject at this fall's UN First Committee meeting at the United Nations General Assembly, and perhaps also mandating the creation of a group of governmental experts to make recommendations on practical measures for enhancing strategic stability. A more ambitious but opportune initiative, in my view, would be for the United States and Russia jointly to convene a global, inclusive, high-level summit devoted to lowering the risk of nuclear weapons use. Finally, I would encourage US and Russian participants in the strategic stability dialogue to explore the merits of having the so-called P5 process focus on how to address the destabilizing impact of disruptive technologies on strategic stability. Such a focus is critical, I would argue, as the leaders of most nuclear weapons possessors appear to have misplaced confidence in their ability to control escalation and undue faith in the infallibility of technology to provide accurate assessments of ambiguous events related to early warning and the need for prompt retaliatory strikes. I've probably overstepped the boundary of what is expected and appropriate for welcoming remarks, but it's been a long time since we have had two administrations that both appear ready to follow the examples of CENESS and CENESS in conducting a wide-ranging and constructive nuclear dialogue. Let me conclude my opening remarks by expressing my special thanks to Sarah Bidgood, who did most of the heavy lifting on the CENESS side in organizing our meeting today. And I also want to acknowledge our gratitude to those foundations which have long supported our efforts to foster dialogue and research on nuclear issues, a number of whom are with us with representatives today. With that, I'm pleased to give the floor to Dr. Elena Chernenko, who I am sure will deftly moderate our first session. So Elena, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Professor Potter. Thank you, Anton. It's a big honor for me to be moderating this session. Good afternoon and good morning to everybody. We have 1 hour for this session, which is on the record. That is for the opening statements and the Q&A afterwards. I think that Professor Potter and Anton already perfectly led us in. So without wasting any of your time, I'm happy to give the word to Sergey Alexeyevich Ryabkov for his opening statement.
Thank you very much. And I also thank Dr. Khlopkov and Professor Potter, as well as CENESS and CENESS for this opportunity. Truly, this is something that should be at the focus for all of us for the time to come. I believe that there is no need to explain to anyone present on this occasion how intensively delegations from both sides worked in the run-up to the Geneva meeting, and how glad we are that ultimately it was possible to produce a statement that reflects upon some of the important issues of a very broad and far-reaching agenda. I thank you for the opportunity to address such a prominent gathering, and I'm very sure that you are very aware that Russia and the US are about to make practical steps towards implementation of the presidential agreement to initiate a robust and focused and integrated dialogue on strategic stability issues. It will take place in the very near future, where our two nations will embark on a new round of what I hope will turn into a mixture of different channels of communication, ultimately leading us to negotiations on something that would eventually strengthen our bilateral relationship, strengthen our security as well as the security of the US, and also reinforce the fundament of the global stability. Through the upcoming dialogue, Moscow and Washington will seek to lay the groundwork for something that is still unknown for us, but that will integrate quote unquote new arrivals, things, approaches, technologies that were not with us at the time when the new start, which I prefer to call just start, was about to be negotiated and concluded. Those who spoke before me mentioned already another important achievement of the presidential meeting in Geneva, and that is the reaffirmation of the political declaration on inadmissibility of nuclear war. Let me draw your attention, colleagues, that some days after the meeting between President Putin and President Biden in Geneva, the Russian president also had a meeting with the Chinese leader. And on that occasion, on June 29, the two countries equally declared that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. Now it's our hope that a similar statement might be reached within the P5 format. Now we are working on respective draft text that in our view will be a strong positive political message to the rest of the world. Coming back to Russia-US bilateral interaction, let me recall the START extension for the 5-year period. It was done early February. We welcome this as a logical and pragmatic decision by the US administration. The early presidential phone conversation on January 26 was instrumental to achieve this agreement. And now, altogether, New START extension and Geneva understandings create, we believe, a good and sound foundation for further bilateral efforts in the strategic area. Importance of this dialogue is growing at times when many elements of the existing arms control architecture have crumbled and relations among nuclear powers are at a very low level and really in many ways in a bad shape. It is obvious that Moscow and Washington have a great amount of discords and controversies in strategic sphere. We are facing an impressive number of outstanding international security and arms control issues, but it is clear that Russia and the US, being stewards of the world's largest nuclear arsenals, bear a unique responsibility for international security. We believe it's high time to re-engage with the US in a systematic, comprehensive, and result-oriented interaction on strategic agenda. This means that we have to address together a broad spectrum of relevant issues. For this purpose, we propose, as a first initial step, to conduct a joint review of each other's security concerns. It would be followed by looking on possible ways how to address these concerns on an equal-footed and mutually acceptable basis, including through arms control. For that end, as we see it, both countries might agree on creating a framework that would help and direct their interaction. The underlying idea of our vision is to jointly develop a new security equation, as we call it, and as you all know this, I have already explained at different fora how we see it. It should comprise all factors that affect strategic stability. In particular, it is important to embrace the entire spectrum of both nuclear and non-nuclear offensive and defensive arms that have a strategic capability. Our point, shared by many, is that in the modern world, the strategic paradigm goes beyond weaponry covered by the New START. And it also goes beyond nuclear weapons in general. That is why this integrated approach corresponds better to today's security challenges. As for offensive arms, we need to pay particular attention to nuclear and conventional systems that could be used in a counterforce strike on targets at the territory of the other side with a view to drastically weaken or even neutralize its deterrent. That said, we consider it to be fully justified to maintain a focus on delivery vehicles and their respective platforms. As for warheads, we favor focusing on the deployed part of the arsenals that pose direct operational threat. And when we mention strategically capable defensive systems, we refer to missile defense assets. We see no reasons to give up the principle of inseparable interrelationship between strategic offensive and defensive arms that remains the linchpin of the very concept of strategic stability. It is equally important to work out common approaches to preventing an arms race in outer space and to ensuring security of space activities. The immediate problem we all face is the post-INF dynamics. The issue of land-based intermediate and shorter-range missiles, whether nuclear or conventional ones, requires a priority attention. Russia put forward a well-known proposal how to enhance predictability and restraint in this area, including through reciprocal verification and confidence-building measures. I believe its essence and details is well known for this audience, so I will spend no time in repeating those. I will just say that we are still prepared to discuss the urgent matter of restraint in this area of missiles on the basis of mutual respect for each other's concerns. We hope that our colleagues will choose wisely and act responsibly. But as implementation of corresponding US military programs accelerates, that space for diplomacy is rapidly shrinking. Let me also reaffirm that Russia did not possess and do not intend to deploy intermediate range ground-based missiles until and unless we see this kind of developments taking place with the US capabilities of this character, US or capabilities of US origin of this character will be deployed somewhere, and it would mean an end of our unilateral moratorium that I just referred to. It would be a very wrong development to the detriment of regional and global security. So we once again urge colleagues in Washington not to move towards this possible new missile crisis. Let me in conclusion underscore that our hope is, as it was with this New START extension, that the pragmatic approach will prevail and the US will engage with Russia in good faith with a view to jointly search for practical and mutually acceptable solutions. To make this happen, interaction should be based on strict parity and reciprocity. If political will is strong enough on both sides to respect the balance of interests, then agreements may ensue, making the world a safer place. The Russian Federation intends to further advocate and promote positive agenda in order to maintain strategic stability and to reverse negative trends in arms control and non-proliferation. Let us not just hope for the better, but also spare no effort in making this better happen. Thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sergey Alexeyevich. You were just mentioning the joint presidential statement and the reaffirmation of the Reagan-Gorbachev principle. And it just reminded me of how everybody was happy to see that on the evening of the 16th of June. And I remember once the statement was published, like all of Twitter, the whole arms control community just exploded with celebrations. So I just wanted to use that opportunity to one more time congratulate you to that achievement. I can just imagine that it wasn't easy to achieve. With
Thanks
that, I'm very happy to pass on the word to Matthew Rojansky.
Well, thank you, Elena, and thanks to Bill and Anton and Sarah, and especially to Deputy Minister Ryabkov. I would also note, we were talking at the beginning of this, that we're quite pleased about the news yesterday that the friend of many of us, Ambassador Bonnie Jenkins, has been confirmed by the US Senate, and I believe is already getting right to work, and I'm sure that Deputy Minister Ryabkov will hear plenty from her soon. I, of course, am not Bonnie, and I'm not speaking for the State Department or the US government or the Wilson Center, even just speaking for myself, Matt Rojansky. But I hope I can add a little bit, I think more in terms of context about how Washington is thinking about the relationship at this point, post-Geneva, and how strategic stability dialogue may fit into that broader picture. So let me start with what I think is the administration's broader thinking about US-Russia relations. And I'll use President Biden's words, because I think these words from April of this year are still very relevant, and I think they still really capture the essence of the way the administration thinks about this relationship. He said, where it's in the interest of the United States to work with Russia, we should and we will. Where Russia seeks to violate the interests of the United States, we will respond, and we will always stand in defense of our country, our institutions, our people, and our allies. I'm not going to spend a lot of time unpacking those words, but I think if you think about basically every element of that statement, that has basically been what the administration has done over the last 3 months since April. Each piece of it, the pragmatic engagement, the dialogue, the pushback and response, as well as the priority on allies. I think you see that throughout the relationship, and values, of course, as well. The goal, as the White House has put it, is a more predictable and stable relationship part of which is clear communications at all levels, including at the highest level. And again, I think Deputy Minister Ryabkov has given compelling examples of that from the recent conversations between Presidents Biden and Putin. Operationally, that means we're seeking to put guardrails on escalation in this relationship. Whether that is possible, it's true, this relationship is in, I think, quite a dire state despite recent positive momentum. So it's untested whether it's actually possible to stop some of the potentials for escalation, but that is certainly the goal. Strategic stability is, of course, the centerpiece of that. President Biden is constitutionally, instinctively in favor of arms control, and that is why he made that phone call that Deputy Minister Ryabkov mentioned on January 26th. This is, not something he was doing for any other reason than his absolute priority on preserving the New START agreement, extending it for 5 years, and preserving the framework for strategic stability. As he and President Putin have underscored, the risk of direct conflict between the world's two leading powers is small, but it's real. And there's a special responsibility, therefore, incumbent on both to take this problem seriously. Now, caveats to, I think, the generally positive and pragmatic tone would be the administration is not looking for anything, nor is it able to pursue anything resembling a reset. There is not going to be a long list of agreements or initiatives like we saw back in 2009 and 10. The expectations are realistic, they're limited, I would say they're quite low, and US allies and partners, principally in Europe, are comfortable with those for the most part. There are some sensitivities, the question of whether the United States and Russia will ever be cutting deals over somebody else's head. Most of you will not have missed the news of the last day or so, the United States and Germany announcing a framework agreement around Nord Stream 2, with some discomfort being expressed by Ukraine. This is a good example of why this issue is so difficult, but the investment that the administration has been willing to make, a complicated situation where the assessment is this project appears to be moving forward despite American opposition. Some sanctions have been imposed, other sanctions have been exempted. At the same time, measures to reassure and support Ukraine and other American partners in the region have been offered. President Biden, as a general rule, has stood very firm in defense of American national interests. And I think it's fair to describe his general feeling or his approach about the relationship as one of tough engagement. And I think both pieces of that are important, the toughness and the engagement. Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, has talked about seen and unseen responses, for example, in the cyber realm. We had a recent example of that in terms of the ransomware attack, part of which we at least believe credibly has origins in Russia, where a clear request was made to the Russian government to cooperate in cracking down and stopping that attack. The idea of deterrence in this area and in other areas is important, but I think it's pragmatic in the sense that it's aimed at future activity. It's not about punishment for the past. I think the idea was to sort of clear the decks, again, not a reset, but to recognize what has happened, to respond to it as needed, and then to move forward. President Biden has consistently talked about de-escalation. He's used the term thoughtful dialogue and diplomacy, and again, always looking to reestablish stable and predictable relations. That said, I think there are going to be some bumps in the road ahead. We know that CBW sanctions are forthcoming. Those are mandated by US law, and they will come. Now turning to the strategic stability dialogue itself, as President Biden has said, the United States and Russia have a special responsibility when it comes to strategic stability and preventing dangerous escalation, given the size of our nuclear arsenals. That message was certainly underscored and I think very much supported, as a number of us have pointed out, by the repetition of the Reagan-Gorbachev formulation. That said, there are significant disagreements below that point between the sides, and I think no expectation of rapid resolution of those disagreements. Moreover, there are risks, what you could call the known risks, and then the unknown risks when it comes to escalation. I think we have to be cognizant of those as well to the extent that we can. I think Deputy Minister Ryabkov has very eloquently laid out a number of interrelated areas that are going to have to be addressed in what you might call kind of the main track of a strategic stability dialogue. There are traditional strategic issues, New START itself as a framework, transparency, inspections, all of the kind of complicated technical issues that go into maintaining that framework. There is the question of what happens in the wake of the INF Treaty's demise. There is the question of the interrelationship between missile defense and offensive capabilities. And then the question of non-strategic nuclear weapons as well. Some of the technologically newer issues will certainly need to be addressed, although this is likely going to have to be, and I recognize the next panel is going to address the questions of format. This would probably have to be in kind of more technical working group settings, not at a high political level. But the issue of where cyber intersects with strategic stability and with nuclear security, there is probably low-hanging fruit around the idea of not targeting one another's command and control systems. This would seem to be a kind of natural and obvious point on strategic stability. Again, Deputy Minister Ryabkov has mentioned the space issue. I think more broadly, it would be a mistake to try to avoid talking about other behaviors we view as destabilizing in this context, because stability is a continuum. So when we think about regional conflicts, we think about cyber attacks, we think about political interference, and even military close calls between conventional forces, whether on land, at sea, or in the air. All of these issues have a potential for spillover into escalation, which invokes strategic stability. And so while I wouldn't argue for the SSD to look anything like a bilateral commission as we had back in 2009 and 10, in fact, all the way, I think, until 2014 formally, I think we're going to have to be open to addressing some of the topics that impinge on the issue of stability more broadly. That said, I think some of what we do is going to be done in parallel, so not within the SSD, but Deputy Minister Ryabkov may be dealing with it anyway in his broader capacity with responsibility for the U.S.-Russian relationship. So, for example, this concept of sort of mutual respect, but nonetheless recognition of where we have an adversarial relationship. I think that is the right framework to approach the conversation today. That in a sense, we will take one another more seriously, perhaps than we have over the last several years, even though we understand that there are very significant risks of escalation between the sides. The recent phone call discussion on ransomware, I think, is probably a good example of that. That said, the United States, I think, is not yet fully satisfied and views, in terms of a parallel discussion on cyber issues, views this as a test case. If ransomware attacks, in terms of the Russian ability to crack down on those, if those decline, if there is a significant action against those, that would be a good indicator that we can have more of a robust and broad dialogue on cyber issues, which I know the Russian side has supported in the past. Similarly, I think there can be a complementary but separate dialogue on restoring diplomatic capacity, diplomatic infrastructure on the two sides. Again, a very good sign that the two ambassadors were sent back, but I think that the deputy minister could offer a very long list of to-do items on diplomatic capacity. I certainly would echo that from the non-governmental side. It has eroded dangerously. It is really at a low level right now. And then the issue of regional conflicts. Again, I understand this is not something that is traditionally thought about in the strategic stability context, but it is an area, I think, of relative success, even over the last several years. Special envoys have had productive dialogues about North Korea, about Afghanistan, about Syria, so continuing those conversations in parallel formats, perhaps not within the SSD, will nonetheless be important to the SSD. I want to be clear about how I see that interrelationship. And I completely agree with the deputy minister in hoping for a pragmatic approach to prevail, seeking good faith and interactions based on reciprocity, and reversing recent negative trends. But let me conclude with some risk factors. Number one, I think we can't overestimate the available time and resources that is going to be devoted to SSD. We need to manage the domestic politics and perceptions around what this dialogue is seeking to achieve. There is a real risk of setting expectations and then not delivering, at least in terms of timetables. We need to respond when we see further provocative and destabilizing behaviors. At the same time, we need to avoid, I think, the real risk that the response will be turning out the lights on the dialogue itself. We have seen that in the past. I would just offer a very clear warning here. I think the political temptation will be to cancel dialogue if we see escalatory and provocative behavior. And that, of course, doesn't serve anyone's interests in the long term. So time is a pressing issue. Implicitly because of politics, as everyone will understand. The US midterm elections are essentially already around the corner, as they always are. President Biden in 2024 will face re-election. And then Obviously, in terms of the strategic stability dialogue itself, the New START agreement will not last forever. We do have a deadline that's now less than 5 years away, and that time can tick by very quickly. But in general, I am more optimistic than I have been for a long time. I think we are on the right track, and I'm deeply grateful for this opportunity to learn from all of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matt, for your opening remarks. Now we proceed to the Q&A part. If you would like to ask a question, there are several ways to do that. You can use the raise your hand button, or you can send your question into the chat or to the comment chat or to me, and I will then see and call you for your question. Let me use this opportunity to ask 2 short questions to the speakers as a moderator. My first question would go to Sergey Alexeyevich, if that is possible. Matt Rojansky has put a lot of emphasis on cyber, on the aspect. And we know that just a few days ago, in the end of last week, the first consultations on cyber happened according to the Kremlin and the White House, but there wasn't much information on their outcome. Could you maybe enlighten us on what was discussed and what's the deliverables?
Well, thank you, Elena. That was not the first, but the 4th round of consultations on ransomware as wanted by the US, but on a much broader agenda as we pursue. Let me be very explicit in our approach. We are not against talking on issues that disturb the US administration to this end, but it means that, number one, we should use proper and appropriate channels of approaching things, and that is to act according to existing legal assistance treaty. This is a requirement on the Russian side, and also to use channels that duly involve agencies that do so professionally on each side. And fortunately, we have been able to achieve some good results, especially on the latter, on the second part of this proposition. We want this dialogue to cover the whole ground with all importance, again, that the US side attaches to what the US believes are attacks of hackers driven by criminal motives. We need to look at this from a perspective that also has a more direct link to the purpose of strengthening of strategic stability in general, to an extent that we also should ultimately deal with issues like possible risks associated with malign activities in the cyber area, in internet and elsewhere, that may negatively affect operations of command and control of our armed forces and things like this. Speaking generically, we favor not a selective, a menu a la carte type of an approach produced and pursued by the US side, but a comprehensive one with full reliance on the existing legal channels of communication. This is an indispensable element of our approach to this whole issue. Probably I'll stop here.
Thank you very much.
One more word, and this is very consistent with what President Putin put forward in his statement of September 25 last year, offering to Washington a set of ideas how we should deal with these issues to assuage concerns that both sides have, not just the US, but both sides have. We have dozens of attacks originating from the US, and in the bulk of those cases, in fact, on the vast majority of those cases, we have no meaningful response on the US part to our requests for information, our needs to cover this ground in a proper manner. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the short question to Matt, you have mentioned diplomatic capacity, and I think this is crucial to implementing the things that the sides agree upon, issuing visas to facilitate further negotiations and all that. Now, Russian officials have several times said that they are ready to, now I don't know the English word for that, obnulit, to zero, to lift all of the restrictions that are there. And it seems like they're more flexible than the US side is. So the question is, why do you think is the administration so inflexible on these issues?
Thanks.
Well,
Oh, sorry.
sorry, I thought it.
That's a question to Matt, but I'm very happy if you could answer that too.
Sorry for just jumping into it. I'll be back on this. Thank you.
Well, it is an important question, Elena, and as I said, I want to be clear, I don't necessarily see the discussion of what may be possible in restoring diplomatic infrastructure as being part of SSD, but it is something I think we would like to see in parallel with it. And I do think that there is a relationship in terms of the broader capacity. We are getting to the point where we can communicate with each other. I mean, look, we could communicate with one another in the worst times in the Cold War, but some of the fundamental infrastructure of the relationship, if you will, is being damaged. Some of that I can see from the non-governmental side is actually generational. And I think both sides should appreciate that we're creating a situation where, in terms of, as you mentioned, visas and travel, but also in terms of officials who spend time serving, whether it's permanent tours or TDYs, temporary duty in one another's countries, we're just narrowing the circle of people who are experienced in managing this relationship. And I think that that's a terrible mistake. If you look at the article that President Biden, at the time, former Vice President, future candidate Biden, co-wrote in Foreign Affairs, I think it was in 2017, he actually spent quite a lot of time talking about the relationship between these two peoples. And I know this is something that he's given thought to. You have several 100 million people between the United States and Russia. And one way for political leaders to think about the interests of their countries is to think in the longer term future. So diplomatic infrastructure is a long-term future issue. You asked a pointed question about why. I don't want to do the usual Washington thing, which is to sort of blame everything bad on the previous administration, but I will do that partly. And some of this is bipartisan in saying I have never supported the idea that you use either dialogue or the very existence of diplomatic channels as a reward for behavior that you approve of. In other words, you wouldn't create new diplomatic missions simply because you like what the other side is doing. So if you don't like what the other side is doing, you shouldn't destroy diplomatic missions. That said, and this is very important, looking forward, it is essential that American diplomats or American personnel who are working in Russia have full and necessary protections and have access to the services necessary for the full functioning of United States embassies and consulates. I think to the extent that those issues can be assured, I would expect that a lot can be resolved. Again, just speaking for myself, if we take a prospective attitude, if we take a forward-looking attitude, but assurances and those kinds of protections are absolutely essential because, at least anecdotally, again, I've always been, very well treated when I've been in Russia, and I'm appreciative for that. And the deputy minister has been very kind to meet with me a number of times. But I know anecdotally from some of my colleagues who have spent time in Russia that they haven't been well treated, and I know that there are complaints about the treatment of Russian diplomats in the United States too. So I think if we're forward-looking about providing the assurances and guarantees that we need for that, I think a lot can be resolved.
Thank you. It seemed that Sergey Alexeyevich also would like to comment on that, right?
Yeah, thank you. And the comment is a very short one. That is, we are prepared to go as far and as deep, if you wish, into improvement of the environment for diplomatic missions and visitors in our country to an extent exactly as the US would be able to agree within their own system. We will not beg for it. We would be fine, and we will find ways how to work if things wouldn't improve. But here, as on all other aspects of our bilateral relations and dialogue with the US, there is no place for unilateral concessions on the Russian side, some unexplainable flexibility. Everything is very cool, very calculated, very tit for tat, very reciprocal, very mirror-based. This is the concept and the only algorithm applicable here and elsewhere. If it's not acceptable for the US, if it will not work for the US for whatever reason, then there will be no improvement, no progress, no deals, no agreements, no understandings, from visa issuance over to cyber, further over to strategic stability, to risk reduction, to anywhere. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have 4 questions so far. I would propose to go in the following order. Bob Einhorn, then Dmitry, then one question came to the chat from Noah, and then Adlan. Bob Einhorn, go ahead.
Elena, thank you so much for giving me the floor. I have a question of Deputy Minister Ryabkov about the scope of the strategic stability dialogue. I believe that if nuclear weapons are ever used again, it will not be a massive sudden bolt out of the blue. It will be the initiation of nuclear attack in the midst of an ongoing conventional conflict. So if you want to prevent nuclear war, you should want to prevent conventional hostilities altogether. And in the US-Russia context, that means preventing hostilities along the NATO-Russia border through such measures as confidence-building measures, transparency, communications, the kinds of measures that have been in the Vienna document, even conventional forces in Europe, CFE type, constraints on maneuvers and deployments and so forth. Are these kinds of measures, is there a place for these kinds of measures, often in a regional context, in the bilateral strategic stability dialogue? Thank you.
Thank you. I don't think we will have these issues as topics of priority, so to say, before us in the initial round of strategic stability dialogue that is due to take place shortly. I do think it will come up one way or another further down the road. I'm not particularly ready at this point to discuss in what framework and in what context it may appear, not least because due to the nature of those things, it's not just about US-Russian bilateral dialogue and or bilateral dealings, but it's a broader format, and the issues of a broader reach, so to say, are more difficult to be discussed and debated in absence of those to whom they concern because of geography and because of developments of recent years and decades. So we have platforms like Forum for Security Cooperation in Europe, in Vienna. This is an appendix to OSCE, so to say, where delegations are present and expertise is accumulated. And I think this is the place where such things should be discussed without, of course, detriment to possible exchanges on this on a bilateral basis with the US. On risk reduction and how to diminish risk of escalation, let me just point that we, at early moment in our discussions with the Biden administration on the statements from the Geneva meeting, were ready to have a professional exchange on an inadmissibility of any conflict between nuclear weapon states. We were ready to introduce language to this end into the statement. It didn't work, but it doesn't mean that we are not ready to pursue this further. It may be one of the issues that will appear before us as we progress in our exchanges with the US on, not least, debates on concepts, doctrines, things like this. Again, very premature to talk on what might be the formats where it will take place, but it's unavoidable that we will face it. And let me also recall as a final point to this very important, and I would even say central question, if we're serious about lowering the risk of escalation, that last year under the previous administration, we introduced an idea of complete stop for any military exercise along the borderline between NATO and Russia, at least for the period of pandemic. It didn't work, regrettably, but predictably, and we continue, we continue to believe that at these times of great challenge for international security and European security in particular, the other side, that is NATO, tries to use this period for additional tests of Russia in terms of sustainability of our security and defense, in terms of our capabilities being at an appropriate level in different areas and things like this. And we will do the same towards NATO and the US, although this is not our preferred way to go. But as on the issue of diplomatic presences, everything could be found in the files in Washington, Brussels, and elsewhere in terms of very particular, very specific and practical proposals, suggestions, ideas put forward on Russia. The moment US is ready, we would be able to engage in a meaningful way.
I think Matt had a comment on this too, right?
Yeah, I understand we're short on time. Let me keep this very short because, Bob, I think you've actually raised a critical point. A bolt from the blue is one thing, kind of, arms race stability in a classical sense, but it's really crisis stability that we need to think hard about. And the realistic context in which a crisis will be provoked is Europe, first of all. I mean, I think history tells us that. It's a European security environment that is broken. And it's one in which exercises and deployments and maneuvers are used for signaling purposes. So the question is, and by the way, here, I'm very cognizant, having recently read Sergey Khlopkov's excellent history, Nuclear Folly, using Soviet archival materials to tell a much deeper history of what happened on the ground during the Cuban Missile Crisis, that we have a lot of work to do in terms of shoring up the principles of direct communication and crisis management communication around exactly these kinds of incidents. So I'm not here to say that strategic stability dialogue needs to immediately launch a working group on this question of crisis management dialogue. But such a working group should exist. That's my personal view. And if it happens in parallel, God bless, that's fine. But this is a realistic way of approaching crisis stability, and that's core to strategic stability. So thank you for making the point.
Thank you very much. Dmitry Stefanovich, please go ahead.
Thanks, and many thanks to CNS and CENESS for hosting this event, and to Deputy Minister Ryabkov and Matt for providing these introductory remarks and answering questions. I have a very short question with two sides. I understand that strategic stability dialogue is not only between the MFA and the State Department. There are other parties that have to be involved. So my question to probably more to Matt, who knows better how things in Washington, how is the interagency process these days? And is there any chance that those long-standing, well, not ban, but almost ban on military-to-military communication and cooperation will be lifted? Because obviously without the actual involvement of military experts, we won't go far in this domain. Thank you.
Again, I'll answer this as quickly as I can. Thank you, Dmitry. Look, the request has been made. I've heard it a number of times from Russian colleagues. It's very relevant. That said, what I hear from American colleagues is, number one, the Defense Department is interested in dialogue. There is a technical legal problem here. It can be addressed through a waiver. It is ultimately going to be the president's decision. I think, and I've described the way that the president thinks about this relationship. I think you should take that as a reassuring way of thinking. That said, there's no question that uniformed military and DoD civilians are going to be completely read in on the U.S. strategic stability approach. I would use this occasion to flag one concern that I personally have, and that is that historically, these types of dialogues have been much more successful when the legislative branch of government is engaged in some way. Thus far, I don't see a big move in that direction. It won't surprise you that there's a lot going on Capitol Hill, including at this exact moment. And I don't think that there's a huge amount of attention and capacity to have something like an arms control observer group, which you might remember from the history of what ultimately became the START agreement. But I would personally recommend something like that between now and 2026, because at that point, we're going to need a Senate ratification, if nothing else. And as we know, the Congress has gotten very muscular and very creative about intervening, even when ratification is not required. So I think that's where my concern is, to be honest. It's not with the uniformed military.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, Sergey Alexeyevich has to run urgently, right? So we have 10 more minutes for the session, but I understand you are out of time.
Well, I thank you for this opportunity once again. This is not staged. I received a phone call, which I cannot be just skipped over. Thank you. And I truly believe that next time we talk, we will not just repeat well-known approaches, but we will depart from some points from where we could measure progress. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sergey Alexeyevich. We have at least 2 more questions. The next one is from Noah. Do I see you on the screen? Yes.
Thanks, Elena. When we had more time, I had a question and a comment. The question was for Sergey Alexeyevich, so I will skip that, but I will still give the comment. The comment was actually quite simple. It was something that Professor Rojansky mentioned. The cyber issue in strategic stability talks is, I'm worried, going to become quite toxic. And in this regard, one of the things that I wanted to say here, and I'll say as often and as loudly as possible, that I agree with you that the declaration prohibiting, even if only in a political sense, cyber attacks on nuclear command control and communication systems is low-hanging fruit and should have been done already, in my view. Just my opinion, a note, sort of an addendum to that is, I do feel that if that even becomes possible in the working group that's been established, does need to be separate, in my view, from the ransomware discussion. Because if we proceed from the assumption that the prohibition against attacks on NC3 systems is indeed low-hanging fruit, I think it should be. I think that miring that in the ransomware discussion is going to be going to make it much more difficult to get a simple declaration on paper. But that's just my view. I agree with most of what everyone has said, but that's something that really got me to perk up my ears.
The next question to Adlan and then Sarah. And then I think this will be then the final two questions.
Good morning and evening. Glad to see so many familiar faces in the virtual room. Thanks CENESS and CNS for hosting the event and for inviting to be part of it. My question goes to Matthew Rojansky, and it might not be related to US-Russia dialogue specifically, but more of a general question. When I look into the prospects for the JCPOA restoration, it sometimes looks to me as it will be a one-term deal, and the return to this agreement might not survive through 2024 when a new administration will come, and that might not necessarily be another Biden administration. So my question is whether we can arrive at agreements between US and Russia with such political instability of presidential cycles, and whether whatever is negotiated during this administration might survive several administrations, regardless of what political grouping or party those administrations represent. So to what extent this administration may represent coherent US policy as of a nation rather than of one single administration with the expiration date. Thank you.
Well, thanks for the question, Anton. I mean, there's not any black magic here. It's a problem. Politics is a real problem. It should be understood as a risk factor. I think it should be reassuring, of course, that even after a 4-year hiatus and some dramatic statements and actions by the Trump administration, the Biden administration has returned to essentially the same policy line the United States had previously. So at least you're talking about 2 possible states of the world and not 10 different states of the world. But you have to take the risk factor into account. I think there's a broader point here, which I would love to address to my Russian colleagues. As a lawyer, and in fact, someone with training in public international law and national security law, I'm acutely conscious of the importance of legally binding versus political agreements. On the other hand, I'd like to remind you, and I know my Russian colleagues always talk about legally binding commitments, perhaps as, in view of exactly this political problem. But the flip side of it is, wouldn't you rather be certain about the political commitment from the side that you're dealing with than trust only in a willingness to observe the letter of the law without really the ability of international law to enforce those things without political will? So essentially what I'm saying is what we need to do, and I made this comment earlier, is ensure as much as possible that you have the full political will. I think within the Russian system, it's relatively easier to know that, because if you hear from the Kremlin that the political will exists, you don't have to worry overwhelmingly that there's some other part of the system that is going to undermine that. In the American system, I think it's crystal clear. If you don't engage Capitol Hill, if you don't have a full reflection of commitment, at least on a bipartisan majority basis from Capitol Hill, then it is hard to have as high a degree of confidence. And that's why internally in the United States, I always advocate as much as possible for engaging Capitol Hill, taking their concerns seriously. The flip side of that, when members of Congress are involved, they have to take that responsibility seriously. In other words, they cannot behave in a way that I think you see very often in legislative bodies, which is kind of pure rhetoric, not having to be responsible for the foreign policy consequences. If members of Congress are fully engaged in a foreign policy decision like negotiating a treaty, they're also responsible for the outcome. It's not just the executive branch that has to deal with that. So to my mind, that's the only solution. It's not magic, but I would argue that's more important than the obsession with kind of signing legally binding treaties, for exactly the reason that you say.
Thank you very much, Matt. Just a really short comment on what you said in your last part of the answer. I think for Russians, it's just unimaginable to even think of a situation where a member of the Senate would block a crucial representative of the State Department that is about to go negotiate with the other part in just a week, and blocking it from the confirmation, absolutely blackmailing the administration was their demands have been. That's just crazy even to watch from the outside, and it's really hard to explain when we have to write about this, like why that it is so and how this can work at all. But I guess everybody in the arms control community is very happy that this process is now over and then Bonnie Jenkins is confirmed. Well, Sarah Pitka, the last question for this session.
Thank you so much, Yelena, and I hope I'm not taking us over. But Matt, I suppose this question is for you. I was curious, as many of you on this call know, I'm very interested in sort of past risk reduction measures, many of which were negotiated or concluded in the early part of the 1970s. Thinking here about the 1973 Agreement on the Prevention of Nuclear War, the 72 Agreement on the Basic Principles of Relations. And I'm wondering if you've heard anything about sort of an interest in reaffirming commitment to those agreements, because it strikes me that as far as I know, they remain in place, and a number of them do kind of lay out the types of rules of the road that we're talking about. So I just wondered if you knew what the status of those were and if you'd heard any talk about those.
Sarah, it's a great question. I have not done anything like a full study, but I've looked into the 1972 incidents agreement and talked with some former senior military officials who assure me that in fact, the principles are very much intact. It is in force. And your point about a reaffirmation is a good one, and it dovetails very much with this core idea in this conversation that we're having, which is, let's not imagine that there's some kind of fundamental difference between kind of legal niceties that are clean and perfect, but can exist in a kind of isolated abstraction where they don't work, and political realities or security realities. This is a case where, although legally it may be unnecessary, I'm sure State Department lawyers would say, look, it's unnecessary to reaffirm. What does that even mean? It's legally binding, it's a contract, it's a treaty. On the other hand, a reaffirmation by the leadership could be very powerful. Now, when you get into the question of updating an agreement, right? Adding technologically relevant concepts that didn't exist 50 years ago, that is different. I think there you would have to have a proper negotiation. And I understand, I obviously will not speak for the minister, but I understand Deputy Minister Ryabkov's reluctance to open that conversation, because that may in fact be appropriate. It may be necessary to kind of negotiate some new rules that are relevant to today's activity, today's technologies. And I would, not to bring in a whole other concept at the very end here, but if you think about conventional forces in Europe, which has been a really neuralgic and difficult area of our security relationship with Russia, the changing geopolitical map is another issue that is really not entirely accounted for in the 50-year history of conventional confidence building and crisis management.
Thank you very much, Matt. Thank you for all the participants and everybody that asked questions. I'm closing now the session. We're perfectly on time, exactly 1 hour. It's a pity that Sergey Alexeyevich had to go, but I understand that he is on diplomatic duty 24/7 and we have to excuse him.